study looking at the impact of foreign aid on on governance, quality of life, and the economy. And so foreign aid can take a few different forms. It can be in the form of project financing. This is like funding factories, bridges, dams, things of that nature, loans, cash grants, just giving them money for whatever they need. Debt relief, like if they've taken on too much debt and can no longer pay it, that debt can be forgiven and be counted as foreign aid. It can also be in the form of food, obviously. And so foreign aid, as we consider it today, was first implemented through the Marshall Plan. This was at the end of World War II to redevelop Western Europe. And because it proved to be a huge success in that time, similar programs were implemented for other developing countries. And studies looking at these, the evolution of this, how they implemented this foreign aid has changed over time. Like the focus has always been for economic development, but the way this has been done has changed over time. Like at first it focused more on the project financing of foreign aid, and then today it focuses more on the social institutions of the country, such as how well the government regulates the country, how well the justice system is, the police force, things like that, making sure those are running smoothly in order to spur economic growth in the country. And so, but findings looking at these efforts have been inconclusive. Some say that they have been effective, that they're helping many aspects of the population's life. Some say that's detrimental, that's actually hurting the growth of the economy. And others still say that the questions that are being asked are the wrong questions, such as because the data right now is aggregated, it's just lumped together, and so it doesn't take into account which foreign aid was in the form of project financing, which ones were loans, which ones were in the form of food. It doesn't take into account those aspects. So some say we need to look at those aspects separately in order to really analyze the different relationships that are out there. And so I conducted a study last year looking at the effects of foreign aid on economic growth, and I ran an ordinary least squares regression. And these types of regressions are very susceptible to endogeneity, which is when an outside variable that is not inside my model influences my dependent variable. And so, of course, you don't want this. And so in my study this year, I ran a fixed effects regression in addition to the ordinary least squares regression. And in theory, this is supposed to get rid of that endogeneity over time. And so in my current study, I looked at the same independent variables as last year. I looked at capital formation, initial GDP per capita, population growth, secondary education. And so my study, like I mentioned earlier, I want to get rid of the endogeneity that is persistent in the ordinary least squares regression, while also looking at the impact of foreign aid on the government effectiveness, corruption, health indicators, and economic growth. And so I looked at the years from 1990 to 2015, 59 countries. My dependent variables looked at GDP per capita, health development index, just the overall health of the population, control of corruption. This was a perception of how corruption in the country is handled. And then government effectiveness is just a perception of how effective the government is from the population. And education index, just an overall quality of the education in that country. My data was gathered from the World Bank Open Database and the United Nations Development Program. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm running an ordinary least squares regression, or ordinary least squares, and the fixed effects regression, which is supposed to get rid of that endogeneity. And these are my results. My OLS for GDP per capita was significant and positive, but the fixed effects regression, which is the long-term impact of foreign aid, was insignificant. So no conclusions can be made from these results. So it was an interesting finding. But for control of corruption, it had a negative relationship for the OLS, but positive for the fixed effects. For government effectiveness, it was positive for the ordinary least squares, but negative for the fixed effects. So they had an inverse relationship. But for health development index and education index, they were all positive. So it very clearly showed that foreign aid had a positive relationship with the health and education of the population. And so yeah, the relationship between foreign aid and economic growth is very unclear. And the current literature that is out there right now kind of supports this. As I mentioned earlier, some economists say that foreign aid is ineffective. Some say that it's actually helping. So it's very inconclusive how foreign aid actually impacts the economic growth of the country. But as far as corruption, the impact of foreign aid on corruption, it might be due to other variables, such as like internal pressures from other governments, kind of forcing them or influencing them to become less corrupt over time. But foreign aid making governments less effective, current literature out there kind of like supports this idea. And the theory behind it is that these governments receiving the foreign aid become dependent on it and fail to implement policies that continue economic growth in the future because they expect to keep receiving those funds. But as far as health and education, it's very clear how foreign aid impacts this. One really good example is that, I don't know if it was the 80s or 90s or earlier than that, smallpox was completely eradicated in part because of foreign aid. So it's very clear to see how foreign aid actually impacts the health. And for education, like you can pay for teachers, you can build schools, you can create other programs through foreign aid, so it directly impacts the education of these populations. Same thing with health, you can distribute vaccines, you can offer awareness programs, things like that, and directly impacts the livelihood of these different populations. And so since we know how foreign aid actually helps the health and education of these populations, but we do not know how exactly it impacts the economic growth, we should distribute these funds to what actually does help, which is the education and health. And over time, the funds have been in the trillions. So trillions of dollars have been funneled to things that actually hinder the economic growth. So before we should distribute these funds to things that we don't know actually benefit these countries, we should distribute them to things that we do know, which is the health and education of these populations. So future research should look at what actually causes economic growth which variables, when you distribute foreign aid to them, actually create growth. And future research should replicate my findings to make sure they're consistent and my theories are sound. And these are my references. Now I'm open to questions.
Christian, I loved your research. I thought it was really awesome. Can you go back to your statistical models with the results?
Yeah.
So one thing I noticed that you don't have here, and I'm curious if you already put it in your model and it's just not here represented, did you look at civil disruption? Because I'm assuming that would play a large role in whether or not economic growth would actually be stimulated by foreign aid. And did you look at that, or?
Yeah, I did have a variable that was political stability, which I think is similar to what you're looking for. But that variable was insignificant in like every regression that I ran. So didn't have like I don't know if it was the way the data was gathered or if it just didn't play a role in my dependent variables. Yeah. So yeah, it was just insignificant. Didn't really tell me very much.
Then I have one more small question about another variable you might want to look at too. Foreign debt, like how much they're paying out in debt. So if they're receiving economic, interest from other companies or countries, but whether it also may not be, like the output maybe not. You know what I'm saying? Like you should probably look at debt they're paying out as well.
Yeah, I didn't look at that, but definitely. Yeah. Like my data, foreign aid is very aggregated, so it doesn't show you what was like debt relief, stuff like that. but that would be really helpful to look at.
So, in the beginning, this, was it Marshall? The Marshall Plan?
Yeah.
It seemed very effective. Is
Yes.
that the data? Okay, so today, it has changed mostly to more, would you say, military aid? Or is there still, well, I guess we do still help with food. Would you say, did you find data, is it as effective today with us helping with foreign aid?
Well, like if foreign aid is effective, like helping today, that's your question, right?
Yes, because I couldn't tell from your data. I did see where it seemed like it was effective years ago. But are they still calling it the Marshall Aid?
Well, that was one program for that specific like region. So there's different, like the World Bank distributes foreign aid, the United Nations, the European Union, organizations like that distribute foreign aid in today. And as far as its effectiveness, like it's hard to say because its effects aren't actually clear until years later. So can't really say about today.
So
But
in your study, there were no numbers to show was there a judgment for the effectiveness of the Marshall Plan?
no, well, I mean, I didn't look at that one individually, no.